Hi everyone, I had my first club game of the season last week, so I'll just show you this game. I was playing as white and I opened e4 and we've got the Caro-Kann, d4, d5, and last season I was playing the Panov Botvinnik attack with pawn takes pawn and then c4, but I got into a couple of passive positions and so I decided to try a different line. And we had knight d2, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop attacks the knight drops back attacking the bishop, and bishop g6. And now we see h4 with the threat of h5 trapping the bishop, so h6, knight f3, knight to d7, h5, bishop to h7, and now because of the light square bishop for black has moved around a bit, bishop d3 exchanging that piece off. Black takes. If he doesn't, we get bishop takes bishop and the rook will be on an awkward square and we take with the queen. So these moves were all played pretty quickly and we see queen to c7 keeping the bishop off f4 and bishop e3. Bishop d2 I considered as well, and that's probably more flexible because I can put it on c3, but I was pretty sure that black was going to castle queenside, and I just like the idea of this bishop eyeing the a7 square. So bishop e3, and my opponent played e6, preparing to develop his dark squared bishop. I castle queenside and he does the same. Now I don't want my queen lined up against this rook because it makes moves like e5 possible. So I was looking to move my queen and place a queen on b3. The idea being that if e5, it prevents e5 for the time being because f7 will be hanging. And the queen's much more useful on this square than hiding away on e2. And I didn't want to block in the c2 pawn either for reasons that we'll see shortly. So knight to f6 and I put the knight on e5. So it's a good square for the knight. It's threatening to take the pawn on f7 and fork the rooks. And I'm kind of daring black to take the knight because it looks like he can win a pawn initially after exchanging on e5 and queen takes. But this would be bad for black because we'd get rook takes rook and then queen takes on b7. And with the king exposed, rook d1 check on the cards and the a7 pawn hanging, black's in a lot of trouble there. What he'd have to do after pawn takes is exchange rooks first, and then after queen takes e5, bishop takes a7. This is the position I was trying to tempt him into, and although it looks quite good for white initially, after something like bishop to d6, white doesn't have that much to go on. However, my opponent obviously either trusted me or didn't like the look of the position himself and chose to play knight to b6 instead. And we can see here that if black can put one of his knights on d5 and keep it there, then he'll have a nice game. So we get rid of that possibility with c4. And you have to be careful when moving your pawn in front of the king, but in this situation with black being castled on the same side, you can't really open up any lines or get behind the defences. And we have quite an interesting position here because already black has to solve a problem of his development. Obviously he wants to develop the bishop on f8, but he can't play it to e7 because he'll block the queen's defence of f7, knight takes f7, forking the rooks. And if he were to play bishop to d6 and we get c5, bishop takes knight, pawn takes knight, the queen's attacked, and then white emerges as a piece up. Also he can't move the g pawn to g6 or g5 because I just take on g6 and win a pawn. But my opponent came up with what I think is quite a good move. Played c5, and I looked at this and came to the conclusion that I was winning a pawn and played pawn takes c5. The knight on e5 is hanging, but I'm attacking the knight on b6, and he played the best move, bishop takes c5. If he'd played queen takes knight, then we get pawn takes knight, exchange of rooks, and then he's got to decide whether he wants to leave my pawn on b6 or let the queen or the bishop to that square. So back here, so he's played bishop takes c5, bishop takes. Now if he plays queen takes bishop, we get knight takes f7 again, forking the rooks. So queen takes knight, and then I'll win a pawn, bishop takes knight, and queen takes b6. And in this position, he played knight to d7. What I was expecting, instead of knight to d7, was queen f4 check, hitting the c4 pawn, and king b1 was what I had in mind. And now the queen can't take the c4 pawn because we get rook c1 and win the queen. So that's what I saw, and I was happy with that, believing that I'd stay a pawn up. But when I looked over the game, I saw knight to e4, and this actually wins back the pawn. First of all, there's a threat of knight takes knight, pawn takes, and then queen takes on g3. And so White's best option is just to exchange on e4, and after the queen takes with check, queen takes g2 on the next move, which would give equal chances. So thankfully my opponent played knight d7 and allowed me to keep the extra pawn. So now I had to move a queen somewhere, and d4 was the first square that came to mind. But after queen d4, queen g5 check, I thought the best practical idea was just to play queen e3 and offer the queen exchange and go into an endgame and pawn up. So instead of queen d4, I just played a queen straight to e3, and I was pretty sure that black would exchange queens here. As if he doesn't, then my queen would be more active than his, and he also has an opportunity here to weaken my pawn structure. So he does exchange queens, and after pawn takes we have an isolated pawn on e3, and that's going to need some looking after. And he plays the natural move knight e5, and I had a good think here about how best to defend c4. The simple b3 does the job, but I also have to bear in mind that after b3 the knight will come to g4, where it's attacking the c3 pawn and threatening knight f2. The moves I was looking at was rook h4, keeping a knight off g4, exchange of rooks, rook d8, king to c2, as I can't play rook to d4 because he'll exchange and then take on c4. But in this position I'm going to be looking to play b3 at some point anyway, and then have to get the rook back onto the d file. So I looked at the b3 and the knight g4 line and found a variation that I was happy with and played b3. We saw knight g4 and then rook he1. The other possibility was e4, getting the pawn out of harm's way, knight f2, exchange of rooks, rook f1, knight checks, king b1, so that he doesn't get any ideas of knight b4 check, knight e5 defending a pawn, and then king to c2. But rook he1, and I was expecting him to take on d1 because I can't recapture with a rook, else the pawn on e3 drops, so king takes, and then for him to take the d file, and then I'll play king e2, which protects the pawn, frees up my rook, and guards d2 so his rook can't come in on that square. But instead he plays knight e5, which I think is a mistake. He's got the slight threat of knight d3 check, winning the exchange, but I play king c2 and that's easily dealt with. Advancing the king is a move that I'd want to play anyway in this position, and when his knight was on g4 it was tying me up, making me look after the pawn on e3. And now he plays king to c7, and he plays king to c7, which allows his rook to go to the a file, and I decide the game will be easier without the rooks on the board. So exchange of rooks, and then I play rook d1. So you've got to be a bit careful in these positions, because after the rooks exchange and the king takes on d1, my king will be on first rank and that much further away from the centre. And you also have to check that if there's a knight move, say to g4, that I'm able to come in and defend the pawn. And when I went over this on the computer, it didn't score the move rook d1 too highly, and it's not because there's any problem with the rook exchange, but because of a weakness in my position that can now be exploited. And black played the best move, rook a8, agreeing that the rook exchange favours white, and I defended the a2 pawn by playing a4. Now although this pawn formation looks a bit ugly, I thought it was quite useful. I've got complete control of the b5 square, so stopping black advancing his b pawn, he won't be able to get his king to b4 from where he could attack the base of a pawn chain on b3, as I can just play king c3 at any time. And I thought that maybe I could get my king to b4 and slowly advance these pawns. And it was at this stage that my opponent seemed to lack a plan, and he played king to c6. And it was at this stage that he missed the opportunity to exploit the weakness in this position with the manoeuvre that the computer had found, and why he didn't like the move rook d1 on move 26. Instead of king c6, we played knight g4, attacking the e3 pawn, rook d3 to defend it, as we can't play e4 because knight e3 check, forking the king and rook. And if I move a king across to the d file, then rook d8, exchange of rooks, then knight takes e3. So rook d3 and then rook a5, attacking the h5 pawn. And then on his next move, all black's got to do is play knight f6 and he's going to win that pawn. This was something I was completely oblivious to during the game, and thankfully so was my opponent, and he'd play king c6. And I was really pleased to get in the move rook d4, shutting out all possibilities of knight g4. And from now, the position just became really comfortable to play. Black played knight to d7, knight to e4, threatening to come in on d6 and attack the f7 pawn. His knight goes back to e5, and I'm basically just being allowed to continue my plan. Black's got no real counterplay here. So knight to d6, and there's a little tactic in this position. So I was hoping that he would play rook d8 when I was planning to play knight takes b7, which wins another pawn. The rook's attacked, and if he exchanges, when I recapture, I'm attacking this knight. But my opponent sees this and plays b6. Now after b6, the black king is quite restricted, and I was beginning to see the potential for a mating net forming, although it's one that you'd have to hope that your opponent steps into. Anyway, I play knight b5 next, and it's difficult to find a good move for black here. It's a very passive position move at all, because if you place a d7, we get a rook check and the king has to go to b7 and we win the knight. And he can't move the f pawn because that'll leave the e6 pawn hanging, and play rook d6 and win that pawn. And probably his best bet here was just to play safe rook moves along the back rank and challenge me to make a breakthrough, but instead he plays the very dangerous king to c5. I don't know what the idea behind this was. I don't know if he thought that he could get his king on to b4 and that it was worth having a go, but it's like putting his head into a lion's mouth. His king has just stepped into the middle of all my pieces, and I play king to c3, stopping him from going to b4. And now I'm hoping that I can sneak in rook to d6 and then b4 checkmate. In fact, the best move for him here is just to retreat his king back to c6. Any other move and he's in big trouble. For instance, f6, I'll play rook d6 and threat a b4 mate, means that he needs to play knight to c6, and then I can just take on e6 and his king and knight are completely paralysed. Instead, he makes a blunder here and he plays rook to c8, and after the reply knight to a7, he resigned, as if he tries to save a rook, b4 is checkmate. And so to stop checkmate here, he has to play either knight to c6 or b5, and I go rook and pawn up. So there you go. I hope you got something from the game, and if you've got any comments, please leave them below. Thanks for watching.